Hey everybody, and thanks for joining us again today. And on today's 411, we're going to be talking of the snake, the serpent in the garden. Was it a literal snake, or was it something else talking to Adam and Eve? And as usual, I've got my good friend Steve, Jason, Trist with us. Sis will hopefully join us a
What's
bit
up,
later.
man?
Hey guys, good to have you again. An interesting topic today, and I wonder how many out there are wondering, you know, uh, how does a snake talk and what was going on in the garden? So good to have you on the 411. So let's get into it. So Steve, you did a video a couple of weeks ago on our Glad You Asked series for our church, bringing up this question: snake being, is the snake literal? Is it a literal snake? Is it a figure of speech? And you did quite a bit of teaching on it. And again, for me, it was something new, something I hadn't thought of. I don't know about the rest of the guys if you had thought about it. But maybe you can just do some groundwork for us, Steve, as to what it is or how you got there or who brought the question up, and then cover some ground for us, man.
Yeah, I mean, super interesting. I know there's a TV show, Lucifer. There's kind of all these ideas about what Satan looks like, the sort of devil with the red horns and, torturing people. And we come into passages like this, and we're going to be importing either intentionally or unintentionally a whole lot of stuff that we're aware of or maybe unaware of. And we get to a passage like Genesis chapter 2 and 3, or specifically Genesis 3, where we've got this interaction between this serpent and Eve. And one of the things that I mentioned on this video is, we've been told, rightly so, that this serpent is Satan. And so we start our Bibles, Genesis chapter 1 to get to Genesis chapter 3, and we meet the serpent and we go, oh, it's Satan. But a very interesting exercise for us to do is to kind of almost imagine I'm reading this for the first time and not read back everything that I want to read back. At some point, of course, we're going to do that, but let the story unfold as it unfolds. And suddenly you're asking a whole lot of different kinds of questions. Like, for example, Adam and Eve walking around and a snake starts talking to them. I mean, if we're going, we already know that's Satan. And so we know the story, so we don't need to think too hard about it. But if you're reading it as if you don't know where this is going, you're like, why? Why is a snake talking and why are Christians okay with this? Well, like, where else do we see this? And this is why some people start saying, well, it's got to be mythological. I mean, we've never seen a talking snake at the reptile park. So we therefore know that talking snakes don't exist. And so how can that be true? Or I think sometimes as Christians, we have maybe a simplistic reading of Genesis chapter 3, largely probably informed by being in Sunday school and growing up when you were younger and seeing pictures, Adam and Eve, fig leaves sort of covering them at some stage, and rosy red cheeks and this like happy snake, and we just leave it there. We don't ever go beyond that. But when we read Genesis 3, we see that it's described as a serpent that is more crafty than all the other wild animals. And he starts talking, and Adam and Eve aren't. I think if you and I had to come across a talking snake, we would run. Adam and Eve just very happily pick up the conversation. And so the question is, why and how? And without getting too far into it, I am going to do what I said we shouldn't do, and that is just to go forward, see what else we learn, and that's going to help us interpret what's going on here. But in Isaiah chapter 6, there's a very famous scene. A lot of our songs are about Isaiah chapter 6, and we see Isaiah, he's in the temple, he sees the Lord, he has this vision of the Lord, high and lifted up, the train of his robe fills the temple, and then we are introduced to these creatures called seraphim. Now, seraphim is a Hebrew word which, if directly translated, means burning ones, but that's almost a uber literal translation. If you look at how that word is used in Hebrew and in the rest of the Bible, every single time the word seraphim refers to a serpent, a snake, in particular a venomous snake. If you think about, if a venomous snake bites you, it's burning. And so some people have said a seraphim is a flaming angel, like an angel of fire. And while I kind of get that, if we're also going to go look at every other time that phrase has been used, we see that they're called, that word seraphim is about a venomous snake, very literally a venomous snake. And so we can maybe start working on this theory. Well, maybe seraphim are these serpentine creatures. And what's actually discovered is, archaeologically, people have found from the time of Judah, little icons, little coins with winged serpentine beings on them. And so it actually starts to make a little bit more sense if we start to put this together, that what you either have in Genesis chapter 3, you either have kind of like Satan possessed the real snake. And the reason why I don't think that's what's going on here is just Eve's reaction. She's not freaked out. The other option is that Satan was, and we know that Satan was kind of a more superior angelic kind of a being, and that he would have been a seraphim, one of these serpentine type of creatures, and kind of a throne guardian type of creature. And so it kind of made sense. We know from the book of Genesis that there were other creatures there. When Adam and Eve leave the garden, God puts other angels, cherubim, to guard the exits. And so it shouldn't surprise us that Adam and Eve are familiar with other beings. God is there. Heaven and earth is kind of overlapped in a very unique way. And so they're not just engaging in a boomslang that just started talking to them. They're engaging with a serpentine being known as the Satan, which later became identified as the Satan. Genesis 12 talks about the serpent. And so putting it all together, it really starts to make sense that Adam and Eve knew that they were speaking to some form of angelic being that had the serpentine form, who seems to be either coming from or in a stage of rebellion. And that's why he becomes known as the Satan, which literally means the adversary, the one who opposes the things of God. So that's kind of like where I wanted to start things off. Yeah, Daryl.
You spoke about the actual interpretation of the word Satan in the Hebrew. What was the translation there?
It's technically the adversary. And really, just like you and I can talk about someone opposes me or someone's my adversary, the word is used in a very what's the term, non-personal way. So the word Satan, if you looked up the word Satan in the Hebrew Bible, you would see that humans are often described as Satan, not because they're Satan or because they're possessed by Satan, but they're an adversary in that moment. Now, this might freak some people out. Hear me out. There's at least one occasion where God is described as a Satan, not because he is Satan. Hear me clearly. Not because he's Satan, but he is acting as an adversary to somebody else at that period of time. I can't remember the exact context, but he's opposing something, and therefore the Hebrew word available to them is he's being an adversary. God often opposes us, right? And so that's what they're saying. The difference with this being is that the Hebrew word ha always comes before the word Satan. Hebrew is the definite article, the. So whenever, if you look at Job chapter 1, Zechariah 13 and 14, whenever this particular being is mentioned, he's called the adversary, not just a adversary. He's not just in the act of being an adversary. He is the ultimate rebel. He's the ultimate adversary.
Maybe I can, I just think of kind of how growing up in Sunday school, and then like even my parents who are not necessarily involved in the church, and like they could have told me the story about the snake and the garden, and I can think quite clearly of just times in Sunday school when I'm thinking, oh, there's a literal snake talking to a woman, and as a kid I can't click that there's anything wrong with that. And then I think as you get older and you revisit Genesis, you see like this is peculiar, and then the snake seems to be walking, and the snake's now talking, and Eve's responding. And then especially after just what you shared on the depth of your video, that it's probably an angelic being. So Steve, my question, I think, like just to predate the snake, was so we had the fall of man in Genesis 2 or Genesis 3. So do you think that the disobedience or the fall of the angels where they turned from God happened before the fall of man? Because it seems like Satan's acting in deliberate disobedience to.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. Let me separate those two because they may have happened together, they may have happened separately. What we can conclude, so I want to separate the fall of this Hasatan, the Satan, and the fall of the rest of the angels, which we just generically call demons, whatever the case might be. What we can say for certain is that either Satan had fallen before this, and not much is described there. We might chat about this later, but there are some very cryptic passages in the book of Ezekiel and Isaiah that, again, very cryptically give us maybe some stuff to think about there, but it doesn't paint a very clear picture. Either it had happened before, or this was his moment of rebellion. In other words, Eve's like, I know you. and unbeknown to her, this was his first act of rebelling against God. We don't actually know any more than what I've just said. And with regards to the fall of the rest of the angels, without recapping the whole Genesis 6 idea of the sons of God, it seems very likely that is that moment, that they kind of followed suit, but quite possibly after the fall of man. But again, beyond that, we're actually just doing some educated guesswork here.
Steve, can I hop in here, Jay? Sorry, man.
Yeah.
Steve, a question I've kind of grappled with often, and I even had the question thrown at me with one of my learners, is the question of, had even Adam and Eve not sinned, would there be a perfect world? And my response was, I mean, for me, I grapple with this idea of, was sin really innate in human beings, or was it actually the serpent tempting them? In other words, if the serpent wasn't there to tempt them, would we be born sinners? Would we have that in our DNA? I don't know if it's something to think of. Like, I don't know if Adam and Eve didn't sin, would Cain and Abel sin? I just this idea of, is sin part of the human condition, or is it as a result of the serpent disobeying God? I don't know if that makes sense.
Look, I mean, if you're tempted by something, like whether it's the second donut or that second look at that magazine cover, or whatever the case might be, it's always something external appeals to something internal. And so your question is, was there something internal to Adam and Eve that this external reality appealed to? We don't really know. Here's the way I've tended to think about it, and I don't know if this is a perfect answer, but if you imagine like a needle with kind of a negative side, a neutral side, and a positive side. It seems like Adam and Eve were born with almost a neutral morality, in the sense that they weren't inherently evil, they weren't inherently good. They had free will to choose to do whatever they wanted, but at the point of the temptation, them giving in to the temptation of the enemy, you called it a DNA. Obviously, that's not a scientific term, but the inherent nature became one of sinners, and every human being subsequently is born not with a neutral needle, but a negative needle. And so our inherent free will is not that free because there's actually a bias within me that doesn't have the freedom to fully and freely choose as freely as, say, Adam and Eve did. And then we get Jesus, whose bias was towards the positive. And what that means is it's not like Jesus was a robot and that he couldn't sin. The Bible says very clearly he was tempted in every way, just as we are. We know that he grew hungry. We know that he grew tired and thirsty. And so he experienced many of the tests and temptations that we did. But his will was orientated towards obeying God fully. And so I think there's this very unique moment in history where Adam and Eve, pre-sin, had this almost neutral zone, not a Christ-like, Christ is better, but a neutral zone will that very quickly went to the dark side. Subsequently, we inherit that nature, which is why we need Christ, who was fully able to conform to the will of God, and therefore our salvation is in him.
So that's fascinating. So would you like, because I think of that neutral perspective as like an innocence, like there was just an inherent innocence. So like
Yes.
I love that. Yeah, I've never heard of that analogy, but I think that's actually like we're born with an innocence that was then poised to be biased towards seeking after our own desires or being evil. I think that's spot on.
Yeah. And again, if you really had to push that hard, it might not satisfy every kind of biblical concept.
Yes,
but
yes,
I just
yes.
think in a general sense, that's what I think, Trist, was going on here. But I mean, you asked the question, but what if they didn't sin? I think it's very likely that somebody else would have sinned. However, we're talking about this balance between free will and God's sovereignty. We know that Christ was crucified before the foundation of the world. In other words, when Adam and Eve sinned, God didn't just like face palm moment and like, now what? Okay, plan B. He knew exactly how things were going to play out, including the fall of Satan, the fall of Adam and Eve, and even his plan of salvation and redemption. So, yeah, just in response to your question, would we have lived in like some sort of perfect paradise if they hadn't sinned? And I don't think so. I think God knew exactly that neutral position wouldn't hang around too long, and eventually would make a choice and go one way.
Steve, I don't know. Just what you're touching on. It could be something you're going to bring up in future videos, and if that's the case, like then we'll touch on it when it does. Then, so we're considering that God's all wise and all knowing. So in His wisdom, He allowed the fall and that sort of thing to happen. How would you like how do you explain that to people when they're asking like, then why did He just not remove the snake, or why didn't He just like that element that kept the needle always at innocence? But if there's a video, we can even touch that in later. But
look, I think briefly. I mean, Trist, you said earlier, would we have a perfect world if there was no evil? And as Christians, we obviously believe it. And I just want to keep this in our imaginations that Revelation 21 promises that for those of us in Christ, we are going to eventually inherit this perfect world. But if we think about the role that evil plays, and I was just talking about it today a bit, and it is going to come up more. So I don't want to say too much more about it, but so like if I stick my hand in the fire, and if I don't have the ability to feel pain, I'm going to damage myself even more. And so the pain that I'm experiencing is letting me know that there's something wrong, and that's going to save my life every single time. Stomach pain, heart pain, head pain, go to the doctor, find out what's going on. And so the pain in this world helps me understand that something's going wrong. In addition, C.S. Lewis, we were talking about him earlier, he talks about the fact that God whispers to us in our pleasures, but He shouts to us in our pains. Point being, when life is 100% and we're living our best life now, we forget about God, and we tend to go into like, I'm in control of my universe. But it's when things go wrong that I start to turn back to God and look to Him in my time of need. And then finally, it's just if I don't have any genuine choice. So those who are going to spend eternity with God, and I do understand there's a debate around election and free will and that kind of thing. But if we don't have any genuine choice, then did I ever truly choose God? And so that setup, put that together, I think you've got, I know it doesn't answer every single curiosity, but I think you've got some powerful thoughts to go, I don't like it, but it does make sense. And at the end of the day, but this is the world we've got, and then are we able to explain the world we've got? And so whether you look at an atheistic worldview or some of the Eastern religions, are they describing this reality of pain and evil and suffering? And I think they fall short. And so we can ask about how did we get here and why? And I think there's a couple of thoughts there, but we also need to be able to answer, but how do we explain the world we do have? And I think the Christian worldview gives quite a robust explanation for that. I don't know, Trist, how did that sit with you after hearing that?
No, that makes total sense, Steve, 100% and absolutely bang on. It's just, I think in the curiosity sort of voice or sort of mind in me would want to, get some more intricate details. But I think, that what you said, I think is, I think all we really need to know. I don't know if God wants us to know all the ins and outs and the hows and the whys. Yeah. And a verse we've spoken about is that His ways are higher, and by His sovereignty, He's orchestrated somehow an adversary to be a part of His plan. And in my view, that's next level OP, as Jace would say. So I think you hit it bang on. So thank you, Steve.
And I think it's important for us all to know that it's not like the time's going to come when it's like the devil versus God and like who's going to win. Because yes, at some point you look out in the world and you think it does look like evil's got the other hand. Part of that is just good news doesn't make good headlines. And so we don't always know how to celebrate that. Part of it is 99 compliments can come my way and one criticism can come my way, and just the way we're wired, I'm going to focus on that single negative as opposed to the 99 positives. And so there's all sorts of reasons why I don't think we always see the beauty that is out there. But having said all of that, the cross is kind of proof. And in fact, Genesis 3:15 is prophesied that there's going to come this messianic figure that is going to crush the head of the serpent. And the cross is kind of the evidence that the head of the serpent is crushed, and it's kind of like the death blow. And now the serpent is just kind of like thrashing around, and he knows his days are numbered, and he's going to try and take down as many with him as he can. But we know for certain, like, if you shoot an animal, I'm not getting into the hunting debate, but people will know that bullet's going to take it out. You can let that kudu run away, but eventually it's going to die. And that was what the cross was to Satan. And so we don't have to guess who is going to win this at the end of the day.
So Steve, sorry, Des, I don't know if I'm interrupting you.
Welcome, no, okay, I'll go next.
No,
I want to go first, actually, because I think you might
take
hello, C's, welcome. Thanks for coming. It's just we're in the thick of it here with the serpent and the snake and all sorts. But Steve, you mentioned something in terms of the interpretation of the adversary, also possibly meaning the deceiver, the snake, the shining one, and you also linked bronze in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my thinking goes then to Moses in the desert and the snakes and people dying from snake bites. And it seems the instructions to Moses, make a bronze snake and put it on a snake and as a symbol, again, for us to look to if we want to be saved. And there you've just mentioned it being, a foreshadowing of Jesus to come. But for me, why the snake then? Why the bronze snake? if any symbol is this not pointing to a worship of the bronze snake, for saving, as opposed to some other symbol that's not related to the deceiver or the Satan or the adversary?
Look, what we do know, and again, like one of the frustrating things about biblical theology is that sometimes there are details that are there, we just haven't seen them. But sometimes there just aren't more details and we just don't know what to do with it. And this might just be one of those cases. So what's interesting, so the word for the serpents that came into the camp to bite the Israelites isn't the same word as serpents in Genesis 3. Just like we've got snake and serpent, two words meaning roughly the same thing. So Hebrew's got nachash, which is Genesis 3, and which is more of a general term, and then seraphim, which is the more specific venomous snake term. And so when those serpents or snakes came into the camp, it's the term seraphim. It's not the same term nachash, which is Genesis chapter 3. When that snake was raised, the bronze snake was raised on a pole, it was also called nachash. Sorry, a seraph, singular. So it's not plural. In Hebrew, the ending im is plural, so it's a single seraph. So a burning one, a snake put on the pole. And just to maybe like work with, Jesus actually makes this allusion. And this is where, again, biblical theology at first, it's not always obvious. But Jesus says, just like that snake in the desert was lifted up, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And so there's this connection, this typology connection that like, wow, this thing equals this thing. And it's not always obvious at the first level. And I think the level of interpretation we're actually needing to go in is not, oh, the serpent is possibly going to be misconstrued as the Genesis 3 serpent, and therefore the devil, and now it's going to confuse everybody. I think what the New Testament writers at least are wanting us to make the connection is, here's this serpent that was raised up. Here was God's, for want of a better term, curse. He actually brought upon this plague. There was a curse brought against these people as a result of their sin. Then this object was raised up, and it became the object that if they looked to it, they didn't have to do anything, perform anything. They just looked to it, and they trusted God. In that moment, they would be healed. And so now those are the connections, the data points that they want us to connect it to Jesus, that we are under the curse of sin. And this thing was raised up, and all I need to do is look to it in order to be saved, and trust that God would save me in that saving moment. And beyond that, yeah, I don't know if there is something more to it. I haven't discovered it yet. I'm sure there's some people way cleverer than me that are deep mining what's going on there with the bronze serpent. There are a couple of interesting metaphors with not metaphors, but there are things going on where I do think there are supposed to be connotations towards the Genesis 3 serpents with some of the other bronze imagery. Just a very interesting one very quickly. But Genesis 3, in Hebrew, it's got the vowels. Well, we've got the word nachash, but the old scriptures didn't have the vowels. And so you have to go to look at context to understand which vowels to put in. And depending on which vowels you put in, you either get serpent, nachash, or you get the word for, if you use it in its adjectival form, kind of a shiny bronze thing. And so it seems as if the biblical author wants us to put them together. It's not either or, but it's a deceiver, which is the third of the triple entendre. It's a deceiver, it's a snake or a serpentine being, and it's a shiny one, bronze, kind of metallic thing. And just total crazy thing. If you read the book of David and Goliath, I obviously didn't discover this for myself, but Goliath is constantly being described in his bronze attire. And I think there was a literal bronze, like, I don't think it's just metaphor. He was actually wearing bronze, but it also describes how there were scales on his bronze armor. And so just this like layer of like, here's God's anointed one defeating the serpents. I mean, it's just,
That's
incredible.
unreal. That's
Yeah.
unreal. Yo. So Steve, I just want to, just because I found that quite fascinating. So just with the ancient Hebrew, they didn't have the vowels in their letters. So depending on how we read it, that's how we would apply it. Is that what you're saying? So are you saying? So when you look at Genesis 3, how are we looking at it? Are we looking at it both the snake and the deceiver, or is it?
So maybe just to go back to the first part of your question, Hebrew was a spoken language and a written language, and so for thousands of years, people would have just known like this was the form that we used. We also have the advantage of the Septuagint, which is the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek, and there we've got a clearer idea of what's going on there. The vowels were only added by the Masoretes, which was 8th, 9th, 10th century AD. So we're talking like almost 1,000 years after Christ. And that was because it seemed as if Hebrew was dying. And so they were worried that if there aren't enough Hebrew speakers, we're going to lose some of the meanings of these words and how to say these things. So they invented the vowel part of the language, of the written language. So for the most part, I'd say 99.9% of the text between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, we're on the money. But every now and again, for example, you go read the book of Job, which is probably the oldest written book in the Bible, and you look at your footnotes at the bottom of your page, you're just going to see time and time again, the Hebrew meaning of this word is uncertain. The meaning of this Hebrew word is uncertain. Because you've got a couple of vowels and you've got a couple of consonants, and now you've got options that start to make sense. And again, we're talking like 0.01% of the Old Testament. And scholars are going to start saying, well, maybe it's viable that these are the other options. And you've got to weigh it up. It's got to make sense. It's beyond just being interesting. And when you get to those consonants in Genesis 3 concerning the snake, if you look at the two noun forms, depending on which vowels you supply, you either get the serpent or you get the deceiver. Now, let's just stick to those two. We're actually told very clearly later that he is the Hasatan, which is another word for being the opposer or the adversary. In the New Testament, he's called the deceiver. So we're not just inventing things by saying it seems very likely that the Hebrew authors had both in mind, and then add the third potential form of this bronze concept, the shining being. Remember, the Seraphim were very likely lit up as well, and so it just seems very likely. It's a theory that works very well, that the author had all three in mind as opposed to one versus the other.
Yeah, because the snake and the deceiver come quite naturally to us when we think of Satan.
Correct.
But then he's also described as an angel of light, and just that idea of shining brass is just like, yes, there's a whole new layer. Like it's fascinating when it unfolds like this. It's like
yeah.
So yeah, I think it was spot on, and it's exceptionally intriguing when we unravel this. So
yeah, absolutely.
Steve, so the snake came in kind of walking or high up, and some said the snake came in like that to the garden, and then it left on its belly. Like, what does that mean in a literal term, and what does that mean metaphorically? Like, how do we take value from this as a Christian? And yeah, how do we look forward to that sort of question?
Steve, you're getting it from all sides today. Nice, Jason. Caesar's speechless there. Rendered him speechless.
Look again.
Hello, who's probably watching. Good to have you.
When I get to heaven one day and God says, listen, Stephen, I know you got excited about the Seraphim thing, but it was actually a boomslang, and the Satan kind of possessed the snake. I mean, Balaam's donkey, there was something going on there. Like, it's possible, it's plausible. I'm looking for explanatory power. I'm looking for evidence that lines up. But if you take the former version, and it actually just looked like it wasn't this seraphim being, and it was just a slang in die gras, and started speaking. I do think there's some questions there, but that's fine, and I'll happily accept that, because I think it's plausible from the scriptures. Some have tried to argue that the original snake, that this is almost like a lesson in anatomy, and that the original snakes would have looked almost more like lizards and have 4 legs. And as a result of the curse, Genesis chapter 3, that they now crawl around as they do now. And they would actually, in fact, evolutionists would argue a very similar thing. And that's especially pythons have these kind of like remnants, little bone structures that point to a similar kind of concept. So they say, you see, now obviously they would want to talk about a different time scale and take evolution off the table, but they'd say that's proof of Genesis 3 pre-fall, post-fall snakes. And again, there's something to that. It's not fictional. It's not just people coming up with that after eating too much pizza. However, if we are going to run with this interpretation that Satan was most likely an angelic being, a seraphim type being, and we go with that language, and that's how he appeared, and Adam and Eve weren't too surprised by engaging just one of these heavenly beings, for want of a better term. So what does that mean? I think there's still a lot to it. If you look at the book of Job, I've got the references here, but if you want to ask in the comments later, I can put them down for you. But in the book of Job and the book of Isaiah, the Hebrew word Sheol, which is essentially the place of the dead or the underworld, are kind of like ways we can start thinking about it, is also described as the place of dust. And then if you go to, and this is super obscure, so guys, go read these passages and look for these connotations yourself. But if you go to Isaiah 14, I mentioned these earlier, and Ezekiel chapter 28, there are these prophecies concerning the king of Tyre and his fall. And at first glance, it seems as if it's describing just this king who got full of his own pride, and he wanted to be like God, and God humbled him, and there was this fall. But what theologians have been doing for literally thousands of years have been looking at the details, saying, no, there seems to be another layer going on here. So once again, I'm not saying it's not the king of Tyre. I think it is the king of Tyre, a really literal king. But there are ways he's described in almost a metaphorical way that's like, man, it's almost, he's being compared to something else that's going on here. What is that something else? And so many theologians have concluded that what is being described, what he's being compared to, is the fall of Satan as described in Genesis chapter 3. And if you start lining the data up, both passages, Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, is described as being in the garden. And so you're like, was the king of Tyre ever in the garden? No. And that's why it's like we start getting curious. Why is this being described as being in the garden? And the only other being we know that was in the garden was the serpent. He's also described as being bedazzled with all these jewels, once again going to this idea of being reflective, lots of light. He's been described as being a cherub, which is another just angel word in Hebrew. And so again, just confirmation that he's some sort of angelic being. And then he's described in these humiliation terms, where he, in fact, the one verse talks about, so I just kind of looked at this. So Ezekiel 28 talks about him being cast to the ground and turned to ashes. And Isaiah 14 talks about him being sent to Sheol, the underworld, the place of the dead. And so, again, it just seems very possible that when the Satan is being told to go on his belly, that it's describing his humiliation, Think about a cobra. I'm in attack mode. Belly, I'm in retreat mode. And so under just God's curse and God's sovereignty, he is in a humiliation mode. He's in a curse mode. He's in retreat mode. And there's actually a banishment that he is going to be sent to Sheol, kind of the underworld, the place of the dead. And as we look at these parallel points between Genesis 3, Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, that just seems the most likely explanation. That it's less about, did the snake have a 5-second evolutionary burst here and lose its limbs? Or is there really something more theological going on here, that the Satan was humiliated, his power was shown to be weaker, his future was predicted, the messianic figure will crush his head, and he is sent out of the heavenly court of God into the place of the dead.
So do you think, Steve, like just thinking of Satan and his kind of nature, like how we've come to know him, do you think that's why he's quite limited in power? Like we don't see him really wandering as a snake, talking to people, that sort of thing. Like it ceased because he was humiliated and degraded. Do you think he's like that very thing has been stopped? Or how would you, because that's what I like. My first thing would be like, this is not happening often, and if it is, and I hear someone, I'm a bit skeptical of that, said I met with Satan or something. Do you think it's got to do with him? He no longer has that kind of foothold or status?
I don't know if there's a yes or no answer to that, and I'll tell you why. We know that throughout especially the New Testament, that Satan is alive and well,
Roaring,
and he's very active, deceiving.
Yes.
I mean, he's described like a lion who's prowling around, seeking to destroy. Jesus says, I've come to give life, but the thief comes to take life. And James talks about, if you're, I forget the exact context, but I think it's to do with your pride and your tongue. He says you're of Satan. And so the New Testament describes Satan in very active language. What I think is going on here is that, I've been around 41 years. He's been around for a very, 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 very long time. And he's an expert deceiver. He knows how to deceive and he knows how to oppose God's people. Adam and Eve had this category of these creatures that I think they were familiar with, the cherubim and the seraphim. And so he rebels, and he didn't need to appear as anything else. He just appeared in his natural form, and he deceived them by getting them to doubt God's word. And I think if I had to come across a talking snake, I'm not going to get deceived. I'm going to run for a mile. I'm going to have a long nap. How am I going to get deceived? I'm going to get deceived by certain ideologies that appeal to certain sinful parts of my heart and my nature. Yeah. I'm going to get tempted by certain things of the flesh. And so his tactic isn't going to be to talk to me in the garden. His tactic is going to be to, in various forms and ways, get me to once again doubt God's word, to buy into certain ideologies that go against where God's going with history. So I think he's doing exactly the same thing, but in the way that's going to get me versus what the context that Adam and Eve were in.
So then, sorry, just to follow.
Now you've had a lot of talking here, bro.
Yeah, I know. We just lost you.
Caesar's been waiting the whole time. Yeah.
Okay, Steve. So then, how was he humiliated and he downgraded? Because he still sounds exceptionally powerful, like in just how we've described him and how the New Testament speaking about it. Because if his head was stood on, like there has to be a weakness and a fundamental like shifting in his power or his status, or whatever it is.
Oh my gosh, I don't know how to answer this question quickly.
I see.
Because it ties into also how one sees end times events unfolding.
All right.
Which is its own, there's about 4,000 rabbit holes there that we can really occupy us for the rest of our lives. But there do seem to be some limits on what he can and cannot do. The cross definitely seems to be the point at which his defeat was made certain. And there is going to come a time at the end of history where he is going to be given permission by God to bring, it seems like, all the antichrist human and spiritual forces against God's people. And he's not doing that yet. And I can only assume it's because he hasn't been given permission yet. But at some point, there is going to be this ultimate showdown. And again, we are just guaranteed of the outcome. But it seems as if, if Satan could choose to do it now, would he? I don't know. I just know that God is kind of not permitting that. But at some point, he will permit that. But that idea of Satan gathering all those beings that oppose God is a thread that runs throughout the whole Old and New Testament.
And that'll be his end. That'll be his complete end once that.
I think we'll definitely get into the end times at some stage if we wanting to go there, Jace. But we'll have to block out a couple days to get through some of that stuff and those rabbit holes.
Yeah.
We did have a question come in, Sis.
Oh, no.
I think Chris wanted to ask something. But
Daz interrupted me then, Jace.
Let's go with you, Chris. What's your question then?
Sorry. Now Michaela's thing is on there. Mix, I'm sorry about that. No, I understand now that. Sorry, man. I understand now there's a certain power and almost reverence. I say that word very cautiously, that we have to give to the Satan, to the enemy. But we know that he's not in a fixed place. He's not chilling in the Amazon rainforest, sending out boom slangs, as you said.
Yeah.
But now he's anaconda, whatever. He now at the same time is tempting you. He's tempting me. He's tempting someone in Brazil. And my question is, how is he allowed to transcend geographical regions, time, space? That's almost the character of God. And yes, it sounds like he's still got some of his heavenly traits about him. That's a bit of a tough one to articulate to people who struggle with this Satan creature.
So I do think that he is, and I do think it's biblical, that he is finite, and he's finite even geographically, even though he is a spiritual being, that he isn't everywhere. But just like we talk about World War II, World War I and II, and we're like, oh, that's Hitler. Not every decision was made by Hitler. Hitler was working through his generals and his armies. At the kind of the top of the totem pole, we recognize that he was the big chief that made it all kind of happen. And so we attribute all those things to Hitler. But if you had to go through that with a fine-tooth comb, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that happened that he didn't even know, but it's just kind of done in his name. And so we do know from Scripture that both in the Old and the New Testament that there are, for example, the book of Daniel talks about the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece, that were opposing God's angels. And some battle happened between Daniel and between this archangel and the prince of Persia. And in the New Testament, Paul talks about, for our battles not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And I don't have time to get into this, but most theologians are convinced that when Paul talks about principalities and powers, he's talking about kind of, let's call them generals in Satan's army, as opposed to his gophers and kind of.
So there's like a hierarchy.
Yeah. And so we've got various activities of the enemy. And as a result, it's all under Satan, but I might not have engaged the actual satanic being, but it is all Satan. And then the final one is that I think one of the biggest ways Satan has left his fingerprints in our earth is in what we call structures. And again, Paul even talks about stoicheia. He talks about these structures. And I honestly believe that many of our worldly structures at some point are actually demonically saturated. Now, they're not all evil to go and make you, again, it's not always about killing cats and spraying blood all over the wall. But if we think about almost every earthly system, at some point it departs from where God wants to lead us. And so I still think, even though it's a grid, it's a structure, that there's enough poison in the structure to lead us astray if we let it. Even though structures are satanic. So I'm not saying democracy is satanic, for example.
I was wondering.
But I'm just going, you put enough poison in how it gets set up and how it works and how things happen behind the scenes, even the structure can actually lead me away from God as opposed to God. And that's all I'm trying to say. So filter all that back up and you get to Satan. Yeah, there was a question from Michaela.
Yeah,
Michaela wrote in and she's saying, not sure if we've discussed it yet, but does it deter from your faith if we interpret the garden story as metaphorical, and do we need the literal sense?
Look, if I was, for want of a better term, to play devil's advocate here, so let's say you conclude, because I know, and I don't think I'm stepping out of line here, but I know that large portions of the Catholic Church, for example, teach that Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 are largely metaphorical. And even in some certain Protestant churches and progressive churches, they would teach the same. I think there are a number of things that we lose, but let's just stick to this narrative. Let's say I gave you Genesis 3 as being metaphorical, exclusively metaphorical. At some later time in the development of the scriptures, we get a non-metaphorical Hasatan. And I'm wanting to figure out, who is this person? What can I expect between him and God and me? Who's going to win? Who's not going to win? And I want to find clarity on this. And so as I see clarity, I'm going to start going to the passages that deal with this being. And I think by recognizing, rightly so, that Genesis 3 is not metaphorical, I just gain more clarity into who Satan is, what God's plans are for him, the fact that it was prophesied that his head will be crushed, though he strikes this messianic figure's heel. And it just doesn't make sense if it's simply purely metaphor. I do think that there are very real terms used that have metaphorical implications, but I don't think that means they're just metaphor. I think these symbols, just like the cross is a very real symbol, but it has powerful implications. I believe Genesis 3 is saturated with very real historical realities that have powerful metaphorical or symbolic implications as well. And so as Christians, I think we've just got a duty to understand the Bible as well as possible. Will you not make it into heaven if you think that Genesis 3 is just a metaphor? I don't think your salvation rises and falls with that. But I do believe if we do want to deep dive these things, at some point we've got to make a decision. And personally, I think the responsible decision is to interpret it as not being simply symbolic or metaphorical.
Michaela, I hope that helps. Guys, we've gone long here today. I know we're not finished yet. I've got one more question, and then maybe Jace, because you've done the bulk of the talking. How is this going to change your relationship with Jesus as a young adult? But let me ask this other question. The angel of death. Who is our actual, what is our adversary actually trying to do and get us away from, if you know what I mean? What is the actual warrior? Because if the angel of death is an angel sent from God and people die, that's one thing. So there's death. But what is Satan trying to do to us and to the world if death isn't it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, if he kills me today, I go to heaven. And I mean, we've had discussions around heaven, okay? To be honest, I think
if the angel of death kills you today, you go to heaven. No, if you die.
If I die today, even if Satan caused the guy to jump a red robot and take me out while I'm shopping. Even if he's the ultimate cause, I'm okay. So you're right. Death, and because Jesus rose from the dead, death is not the ultimate enemy. I can have faith that death will not have the final say in my life. The angel of death is a very unique figure that shows up only a couple of times in the Old Testament, and it seems to be like you've got your army of generals, and certain people have certain functions, and so this particular angel had a particular judgment function. Under God's sovereignty, not Satan's sovereignty. But we don't really see much of that in the New Testament. But what is Satan's ultimate plan? I would argue the single biggest word is to deceive me. Because that is true, right from that Nachash Hebrew little bit of intellectual gymnastics we can do there, right to the fact that Satan means he's an adversary to God, right back to, he's called the deceiver in the New Testament. 2 Corinthians describes him as one who blinds our minds. And so if he can just stop us from believing and seeing and trusting God, I think those are the things he's going to do. So, which is why, once again, his chief goal isn't to get me to slaughter cats and throw their blood all over the street. His chief goal is to get me to trust anything, even good things, more than Jesus and his word and his truth. And so if I commit myself to being a good person, but in my heart of hearts, I believe I'm so good, I don't need God, Satan's celebrating.
Yeah.
And so I'm this great citizen on planet Earth, and Satan's going, yes.
Yeah, I think in the world we could quite easily think that death is the enemy. The enemy's won because we've died and passed away from this earth. But it's more than that. Otherwise, the angel of death could easily be considered our biggest enemy and biggest adversary. But it's not that. It's more
Correct.
than that. So that's why I wanted to just bring in that angel of death.
Yeah.
Chase, as a young adult, how do you live differently knowing this stuff?
Yeah, I think one, it's very intriguing. I think just when you look at the Hebrew and get an idea of what the Seraphim is and the Satan is and what his like mandate for us is, like at first I said, like, well, it's great to be aware of this, like aware that there's an enemy that he really hates me and he hates that I'm made in the Father's image. But on the flip side, I don't think it changes anything how I relate to Jesus. I think Jesus is still the same. He's still the man I want to chase after. He's still who I want to become like. I still want to allow him to change me and work on my heart. And naturally, if that's Jesus' mandate, I think Satan's mandate's to come in the way of that. And so as a young adult, aware of like just the troubles that we have, the anxieties of life that young people face with, and that at the end, it's not the be all and end all, that God's still sovereign over our lives. And he has a plan for us. So I think for me as a young adult, just jumping on to board what God's plan is and what he wants from me.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jace. Thanks, guys. Been a lucky afternoon chatting, intriguing stuff, and a lot to chew on. Thanks for those who have watched and are watching. If you find any value, why don't you like and subscribe, and send in questions if you have any, because we want to tackle real life issues for life and faith, and particularly in the young adult space. So we hopefully will catch up with you next week. Not be blessed, and see you guys soon.
Cheers, everyone.